Week after week recently, Jesus has been telling his disciples that he is going to suffer, die, and rise from the dead. Week after week, the disciples are proving that they just don't get it. And if this wasn't apparent already, now today we come to the story of the blind man Bartimaeus, this beggar. There are a lot of important details to focus on here. First, that Jesus is meeting this beggar in Jericho. For those of you who've been to the Holy Land, you know that Jericho is geographically extremely close to the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is one of the lowest, if not the lowest point on earth. That's at least land-wise, probably deeper points in the ocean somewhere. You also know that Jericho is relatively close to Jerusalem, which is where everything surrounding Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection is going to take place. It's no accident that these things are lining up this way in the gospel. Just as the disciples are in the lowest place of their understanding of who Jesus is right now, Jesus and his disciples are physically at one of the lowest places on earth. Just as the apostles seem blind to what Jesus is trying to show them, we find Jesus confronting a blind man. The good news, though, is that once you're at rock bottom, it can only go up from there. Because this blind man is going to show us what needs to happen next. First of all, in comparison to the disciples, the blind man is actually looking for something legitimate, not for power or avoidance of suffering like the disciples have been, not totally missing the mark of what Jesus is trying to do. Another important detail is that this blind man, whenever he's called by Jesus, throws away his cloak. His cloak would have been basically his whole livelihood as a beggar. It's what would protect him from the sun during the day. It's what would have kept him warm at night in the cold desert. And people would have thrown coins into his cloak during the day, where he would collect all of that money so he would be able to survive. He'd be able to buy things like food. But when Jesus called him, he threw that away. How foolish to throw away one's comforts and way of living just to follow Jesus. That's not quite what the apostles had yet been able to do. They were still clinging to their ideas about who Jesus was and what they wanted him to do. That's why they keep falling into these things about, why don't you put me at me at the left or the right hand of you when you come into power? Why Peter kept telling him, no, this suffering thing can't be what you're about. They wanted Jesus to conform to their image. And to make it more apparent, after this man is cured, we heard that he ends up following Jesus along the way. He doesn't try to lead Jesus where he wants him to go. He follows him. And he's following him to Jerusalem. It's also worth noting that the scriptures say nothing about whether that blind beggar went back to pick up his cloak that he had just thrown away. It would make good sense to grab it, wouldn't it? There's going to be more cold nights. There's going to be more sun. Or maybe it makes more sense to just leave that in the past and follow Christ without clinging to that old lifestyle he had been about. On the other side of the resurrection, after Jesus rose from the dead, the disciples who had been filled with the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, were able to leave behind everything that did not allow them to follow Christ completely. Peter, who before the resurrection denied Christ 3 times, proclaims that same Christ to be Lord in the Acts of the Apostles, and it leads him to be persecuted, to be thrown in jail, to be beaten, and ultimately, according to tradition, to be put to death on a cross himself. Though Peter found himself unworthy to suffer in the same manner as Christ, and so as tradition goes, he was crucified upside down. We who have been baptized have received that same Holy Spirit that Peter received. Maybe in the depths of our being, we've felt moved by God to some sort of ministry like Peter, or to let go of something that we've been holding on to from our past, like Bartimaeus with his cloak in the midst of being in that low place, Jericho, both spiritually and physically. Are you ready to go ahead, to forge on, even if it means that might mean following Christ all the way to Jerusalem?